So without further ado, what part do I play in NASA's journey to Mars? So I'm both a researcher at the University of Oxford down the road, as well as a research fellow with NASA in the United States. So I spend half of my year here playing around in a greenhouse, and then I spend another half of the year in the US playing in a greenhouse. So it doesn't really get any better for me. The kind of part that I play in NASA's global overarching trip to Mars is very small. It's a multifaceted plan that's been designed since 2010 with the Obama administration, and has been evolving since, and may even change dramatically in the next 6 months as Donald comes and ruins our plans. So first things first, we've probably all in this room heard of the International Space Station. Yeah? Awesome. So that's actually up here in the very top, and that's our test bed for a lot of the technologies we work on, going into microgravity and looking forward through the transfer stage of our trip to Mars when you go with a bit of gravity back again. So that's a really interesting laboratory that is circulating over our heads right now every kind of 45 minutes or so. So on from there, NASA is actually now developing the Space Launch System, which is their next generation large booster. So this carries on from the shuttle that was retired in 2012 and will be operational in 2018 for its first trial launch. And that we can see here in this kind of top bit. So that's essentially the car that's going to drive NASA astronauts to Mars. Now, more interestingly for me, as well as a lot of people, is actually looking at commercial space ventures such as SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, which is run by our own Richard Branson. And that plays a role too. Originally, this part was supposed to be played for hauling goods and things up to the space station, and then NASA would take those to Mars to use. A little bit like a ferry service for NASA to pay for. But looking forwards, and I'll talk in a little while, these guys have actually decided, okay, we're not going to wait around for NASA, who usually take a long time, we're going to do it ourselves. So NASA's deep space vehicle is called Orion. It's essentially the same model as the Apollo era, just only bigger, more redundancy, more materials, things like that. Looks like this. Actually, the back half, interestingly, the service module will be built solely by the European Space Agency, and then the capsule will be coupled to that and sent for its first trip around the moon, hopefully later this year or early next year. And that will essentially be the shuttle for future generations. Private companies such as Boeing are now developing the transfer craft that we'll be using to go to Mars along with the Orion capsule. So that's the actual crew habitat modules as well as the landers that you see here. The European Space Agency are developing the next generation of solar power panels that you see there. Now, like I was saying before, companies have decided they want a piece of this pie. Mars is open for the taking. No one can actually legally own Mars, so it's a really, really nice prospect for people to actually go and start setting up mining or commercial ventures there. One of these is called SpaceX, which stands for Space Exploration Technologies. They're developing the Falcon Heavy, which you can see here, which is a 3-part booster that are bolted together and then has their own capsule at the very top. Later next year, the first mission that they're going to be sending to Mars is called Red Dragon. It's essentially their own version of the capsule, the deep space capsule called Dragon, that they will actually test and using retro rockets land on Mars. The plan is that this is a great test bed for not only taking astronauts, but also taking cargo in the next 5 years. Companies such as Mars One, seen here, really like the idea of this kind of capsular ecosystem, where you land lots of capsules, bolt them all together, and then you might have, say, a cinema in one end, a gym here, and then a bar, hopefully, in the middle, as well as sleeping quarters. So you essentially use those capsules as your living quarters and growth chambers and things. And you can also extend off of those subterranean modules such as these that protect from the Martian radiation. But more interestingly, I'm going to show you a video. Later last year, SpaceX announced their architecture for their future Mars missions called the Interplanetary Transport System. I'm just going to show you the video that they released right now. So essentially, it's one really big rocket. It's twice the height of Big Ben and about 2 times as wide. At the very top is the Interplanetary Capsule Station itself. And below that is a reusable booster core. So it's just a 2-part rocket, different from the 3 to 4-part rockets that we've seen developed up to this point. And essentially, What happens is this is going to be based on either South Texas or Cape Canaveral. 39 vacuum-rated Falcon 9 vacuum engines at the bottom. They're going to basically power this on all the way to low Earth orbit. At liftoff, it'll have twice to 3 times the amount of power that's generated by the Apollo rockets back in the 1960s. So it's going to be incredibly loud. A lot of work that SpaceX has been actually doing recently is trying to mitigate that sound damage to the nearby ecosystems. Once in orbit, there's one half of that spacecraft will actually detach with all the astronauts, cargo, things like that, and that will then power itself into a parking orbit. A parking orbit is essentially a stable circular orbit around the planet where the spacecraft can stay without falling back down or without escaping into space. Meanwhile, the booster will flip around and actually boost straight back down to Earth from where it came. This is something that SpaceX have actually already achieved 7 times, landing both back on Terra Firma on Earth and also on barges like in the North Sea. So essentially that booster flips itself around and does a reverse park, much more elegantly than I've done outside of your parking. It will land right back on the booster platform, launch out where it came from. It will then be refueled with this methane oxygen supply, and a tanker will be placed on top of the booster. This tanker is essentially just one massive fuel dump that will then go into space and be used for the interplanetary spaceship itself. Once in orbit, the idea is that your passenger carrying spaceship and the fuel carrying cargo will transfer together and the spacecraft will be refueled. Unfortunately, due to the fact that our planet is rather large, gravity prevents us from launching our first interplanetary spaceship with the fuel. So you need that fuel run. In fact, you need 9 fuel runs to have enough fuel to go to Mars, which you see here. Once in the coast, so that's essentially the period between Earth and Mars, that happens once every 18 months or so. You deploy the solar arrays and 200 kilowatts of power are produced. That's only the same amount of power that your car would produce, but actually for space missions such as this, maybe most of that energy goes into life support and Netflix. The idea is that at this point, everyone's chilling out and spending time in bars according to the company CEO, but that remains to be seen. Space down to Mars is an impressive incredibly hazardous operation of the thing. The spaceship around to the engines takes an impact from the atmosphere. Then using retro rockets that SpaceX is developing at the moment, you land on the surface of Mars without using a parachute, airbags, and things like that that have been used up until this point. The idea is that you're on one piece, you go out into the Martian environment, facing nice words like Neil Armstrong, and over the next million years, terraform Mars so that it resembles something like Earth. A lofty goal, but the company has achieved a lot so far, so remains to be seen. So going on from there, this is something like what you'd expect to see on Mars in 2028. The company's projections are actually holding up quite strongly so far. And essentially, the first mission is just going to be testing whether or not they can refuel the rocket and bring it back to Earth. But interestingly enough, we've managed to secure some space on this rocket mission to test some of our greenhouses and plant growth things, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the main issue with developing a colony on Mars is not the technology you need to get there, it's not the entertainment once you're there, it's not surviving, it's actually the food. So each person in this room probably would consume about 400 kilograms of food per year, and at the moment the cost to do that is astronomical, no pun intended, but it would cost approximately £10,000 per hamburger to get to Mars, so it's obviously not feasible to take all the food you need with you. At the moment, astronauts eat food that looks a bit like this. It's all dry, and you have to rehydrate it with boiling water from a boiling water kiln. You have things like steak, down here, which you can't see unfortunately, spinach, which looks disgusting, as well as beef patties and nuts and things like that. This is great, but some of the tests done by colleagues of mine at the Johnson Space Centre have shown that the nutritional value of these foods over time, especially when you're on long missions, decreases dramatically. So you need fresh food to survive. And like I said before, the amount of money to send that up into orbit and to Mars is just outrageous. There's also the problem that if you have to continuously resupply from Earth, you don't have to go through that hazardous descent through the Martian atmosphere again and again, risking the fact that it might burn up at any time. So who here has seen The Martian, the film? Okay, awesome. I have to go through the whole thing. But long story short, for those of you who haven't seen it, this is a real tour de force of how to survive when everything goes tits up, when you have to think on your feet, like the protagonist in the film. Long story short, he gets abandoned on the surface of Mars by his 5 colleagues, and he has to survive for 3 years. Here he is, Mr. Mark Watney, played by Matt Damon. My brother thinks that I look like him. Rather flattering, but I'll take it. So I'm just going to play the clip in the film where he realises that he's actually got to feed himself rather than just eating his crewmates' peanuts.
Right. Let's do the math. Our service team is supposed to last 31 souls. So the balance here send 68 souls worth of food. That's 6 people. So for just me, that's going to last 300 souls, which I figure I can stretch to 400 if I ration. So I got to figure out a way to grow 3 years worth of food here on a planet where nothing grows. Luckily, I'm a botanist. Mars will come to feel my botany powers.
So it's quite dramatic, but actually it's a really, really good representation of what future astronauts will have to do if they want to grow food and therefore survive on Mars. So in this image you see what Mark Watney comes up with. Essentially he drags kilos and kilos of Martian regolith, that is the dust outside on the Martian surface, into his habitat module. He doesn't plant directly outside. The atmosphere is only 1% that of Earth, and it's mostly carbon dioxide, so plants would not survive, despite also the fact that it's freezing cold. So he brings all this inside, makes a nice little greenhouse, and starts growing potatoes. We're now looking at NASA at what potatoes you might even grow on Mars in collaboration with Peru. We've taken essentially 500 varieties of potatoes and are growing them in simulated Martian regolith to see which are the best varieties and can we blend varieties together to make super Martian potatoes. But yeah, stay tuned for that one. So it's actually quite similar to some of the early designs that NASA had for growing plants on Mars. It's not completely wayward. So this is Ray Wheeler of the Kennedy Space Center in a fictional, this isn't real, setting where he's growing plants on Mars. Now the system that NASA were originally wanting to employ was to grow plants in water using something called a hydroponic system, and you essentially grow the plants in water and give them all the nutrients that they need to survive without using soil, and that's what you can see here. Unfortunately, there is a little bit of water on Mars, but the energy required to dig it all up, melt it, and use it is just unfeasible to just grow the plants in solid water, which is why we're moving again towards it using the actual substrate regolith from the surface itself. So this is our most current HAB vegetation module design at the moment. This is something that we're building in collaboration with Boeing at the moment to test here on Earth. So we'll essentially build this module at the Kennedy Space Center and test it as if it was on Mars. And inside it looks something a little like this. So the layout is actually based on one that was intended to go to the International Space Station, but then was retired early in 2014. So you have racks of food growing lots of different types of salads, as well as herbs, tomatoes, things like that, up the sides in buckets of Martian regolith. And then you can change the conditions in each bucket to see actually what are the best ones for each crop. Some of this research goes on from time that I spent in Hawaii. So this is on the top of Mount Kailua in Hawaii at the High Seas HAB. So this is essentially NASA's test bed for Mars. Actually looks a little bit like Mars with the red Earth and things like that. This geodesic dome holds 6 people who essentially pretend they're on Mars. And we grew plants and tried to test what are the mechanisms and things that we need to grow plants in Mars. One of the most interesting things was trying to figure out what kind of equipment you would need to take with you, whether you need shovels and things like that. because actually the soil is very, very dusty. So we found the one thing we need more than anything else was face masks, which was interesting. At least we know now, not later. We also do a lot of experimentation for plant growth on the International Space Station right now. So one of the things that the team that I work for have collaborated on is Veggie. This is essentially a really, really small greenhouse, the size of like a mini fridge, that expands once it gets to the space station. So it's super light for launching into orbit. And on the top it has an LED, you can see the kind of colour of the LEDs, it's purples and reds, which are best for plant growth. And at the bottom, we grow plants in little sachets, a little bit like you would find at your garden centre for growing seedlings. And it's really interesting to see that you can actually grow things like romaine lettuce, and people like Scott Kelly can eat that and not turn into horrible space monsters. So that's a massive thing for us. Now, just going back to Mars. So, what is Mars actually like? How do we even know what the Martian soil looks like? It's mainly down to rovers such as this one. This is the Mars Science Laboratory, which is commonly known as Curiosity. And I'm not joking, this literally is roving around Mars right now, zapping rocks in the soil with a laser and sending back results of what the rocks are made of. It's not science fiction, it generally has a massive laser camera head at the top, and it goes and shoots rocks and tells you what that rock is made of. We then find out that data and can work out what nutrients and what the ground is actually comprised of. So a lot of the macronutrients that plants need to survive, such as carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, things like that, are present, just in low volumes. And more importantly, the micronutrients. These are the chemicals, the elements that you need to provide the chemical functions within plants, such as the enzymes and proteins and things like that, are also present. So a lot of what you would need to grow plants is there, which is great for us. So what NASA does with that data is they make a simulant of the regolith. So that's essentially, rather than going to Mars, pulling all this stuff off the ground and sending it back for us to test seedlings in, we make a simulant that's much, much cheaper. In fact, it's totally unfeasible to actually bring anything back from Mars at present. And then we test our plants' growth in that. So I've got a few pictures of our most recent trials. So this is a microton tomato that we grew in this Martian. This is essentially like growing it in Mars, if you like. And you can see it germinates, it grows quite well, but when you compare that to a plant grown in Earth soil, you can see that this plant's doing much better. So this is just untreated regolith. It's as if you picked it up off the surface of Mars, put a seed in and put some water in. So it's good to see that seeds can still germinate, but we're a long way from having nice fruity bodies up at the top here. We actually ate some of the tomatoes on this plant, and they tasted disgusting, but at least we got tomatoes. And we think the main problem with that is something called a perchlorate salt. So these salts are not commonly found on Earth, but on Mars are incredibly high concentrations within the regolith itself. And over time, these accumulate in the plant tissues and cause it to die, as you saw in the previous slide. So what we've been moving towards doing is taking bacteria that you find in the soil, as well as even some species you can find on your hand, and you culture those, and in some cases you can actually engineer them to perform functions and take away those nasty chemicals for you from the soil. We then put those bacteria into the dust, mix it around, leave it for a month or two, and they degrade that dust into something that much more resembles soil. And then you see that if you try planting tomatoes in that, after you've spent some time letting the bacteria do their work, actually the plants look much better, much healthier, you actually get fruit from them. And we've done this now with 45 different varieties of vegetable, things like pak choi, spinach, tomato, even some strawberries, which are awesome. And actually it's worked with every variety we've chosen so far. One of the issues that we had was trying to keep the bacteria from escaping. We've now engineered the bacteria so that they can't leave the system that we've actually engineered them to be. So these are technically genetically modified bacteria, but being on Mars and being inside a habitat, they're completely secure from escaping and colonising out of the planet. So we've gone from being an unhappy Mark Watney to hopefully in the future being able to take these bacteria with us when we do go to Mars, and we'll be able to grow crops directly in the soil of Mars rather than having to get crappy little plants like the ones I saw originally. So yeah, thank you for listening to this short brief talk, but any questions?
seem to be helping?
Yeah, really good question. So a lot of the work that we do is applicable to areas of the planet that are arid and dry. So we have collaborators in Australia, Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as areas of South America, especially Peru, where they're taking some of the bacteria that we've been using, the ones that we don't engineer, the ones that you just take out of the soil or your hands and things, and have actually shown that if you inoculate those directly onto the soil, they're seeing massive plant promotion effects on things like rice, wheat and maize. So a lot of this research is totally translatable into Earth, which is great, and it's part of the reason why we get funding, otherwise we wouldn't. Yep.
Okay, so this might be a stupid question, but why do you use the LEDs in that data you do? Why don't you just let the sun through the window?
Yeah, no, really good question. Actually, I thought a similar thing until somebody told me that as soon as you open a window on the space station to the sun, without the shielding of the Earth's atmosphere, you just get blinded immediately. So it's actually too intense. The plant will just wither and die straight away. Another thing is that we've now done so much work on finding out what colours of light plants like the most. So actually, if you grow a plant in blue light, it'll produce mostly leaves. So for something like spinach or lettuce, that's great. You just grow loads of leaves and eat that. If you then switch it to a more purpley red light, like you saw in the picture, they tend to fruit and produce seeds. So you can switch between the wavelengths and colours of light to actually kind of tune your plant to what you want, whether you want fruit or whether you want seeds for the next generation, and so on and so forth. But yeah, really good point. Yeah?
Why did you want to learn about space?
Good question. Why do I want to learn about space? So when I was your age, probably sat in an audience a little bit like this, I heard a guy called Lewis Dartnell talking about astrobiology. So that's the study of, is there life on other planets, is there life in the universe, things like that. And I was really kind of captivated by that, and I thought that's fantastic. Unfortunately, as of yet, we don't know whether there's life on other planets or not. But I'm kind of now moving more towards, actually it'd be kind of cool to be part of the team that does take life to another planet, rather than just looking to see if it's happened naturally. So that's why I put it. So.
Is it possible to get Mars soil to be better than Earth soil?
Yeah, really good question. Actually, it is. So when we receive the Mars soil, it's sterile. So essentially just dust. There's no bacteria, there's no nutrients really in it at all. So we can then engineer it to match perfectly the plant that we want to grow. So it's kind of like a blank canvas that an artist would then paint the piece that they want on, rather than going to a wall that's already been graffitied and trying to make something new. So it's a really nice test bed for us to be able to actually take it beyond where you would naturally find out in your playing field or whatever, and actually match it precisely to the plant that you want to grow, whether it's strawberries or tomatoes or whatever. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It can go beyond what you would find outside.
Two bits. Do you think you can meet the entire nutritional needs of the astronauts using these plants, and what sort of area do you need to feed one person?
Yeah, good question. So the area requirements to feed one person, I actually do have handy in one of my slides. So you saw our mock-up of the module that we're hoping to build in the coming years, and that is probably going to feed half a person. So this much plant matter will feed half a person, to even 2 of these per person, for a year ongoing. So it's actually a lot, especially if you're looking at trying to get a broad spectrum. So you need every single type of nutrient, fibre, protein, carbohydrates. You actually need a really wide variety of plants. You can't just grow soybeans, which I thought would be really handy, but it turns out that doesn't work. And another thing is that by growing lots of different plants, you keep the astronauts sane, rather than just eating peanuts every single day for years on years. So it's going to take probably around a rugby pitch's kind of size to feed an astronaut crew of 6.
Would there be any problems with the air? Because the air might not be the right type of air for the plants
The air outside on Mars, you mean?
inside.
Yeah, no, good point actually. So a lot of the experiments that we did early on, we were just growing the plants in the same atmosphere, so the same air that we would breathe. So you would essentially be doing a little like we saw Mark Courtney doing, where he was farming the potatoes in his HAB module. But a lot of the work we've been looking at more recently, you can change the composition of the air, especially by adding more carbon dioxide, which is bad for us, but really, really good for the plant. And essentially you then have the same pressure, the same temperature, all that kind of stuff as we would have. But you would change the carbon dioxide content of the plants very faster, and then when you went into harvesting, you'd wear breathing apparatus. So yeah, really good question. It's not something that NASA thought of until probably 2-3 years ago. So yeah, really good point. Yeah.
How are you meant to get meat if you need
Yeah, really good question. So all future astronauts that go to Mars will have to be vegetarian, which is unfortunate. I love a good steak, but that's the way it is. A lot of the protein requirements that you need can come from plants. So as I was saying, soybeans one. Pulses are great, so things like chickpeas, like kidney beans, all those kind of things. But actually one really grisly experiment that NASA are currently performing is trying to make burgers from insects. So the idea is that you farm insects and then process that into meat, if you like, as a little bit of a substitute for cows or chicken or things like that. I tried one last time I was in the States. It's horrible. I really wouldn't recommend it.
One last question.
Oh, yeah.
So before Mars was not atmosphere, did it have a better atmosphere before? And if so, could it sustain a different type of plant matter that could adapt to what it had in that atmosphere before?
Yeah, really good question. So we know from historical data that Mars's atmosphere was a lot more like Earth's around 200 million years ago. There was liquid water on the surface, there were oceans, there were running rivers, things like that. And we can tell that of the geography and geology of the surface of the planet. We don't know whether or not plant matter existed at that time. It would be really cool to go dig up some of the ground and see fossils of leaves and things like that. My feeling is that if life did exist there, it wouldn't look like plants as we know it. It would be single-celled organisms that function much like plants in that they use light from the sun to make their energy, but they do it on the single-cell level rather than doing it as a